Hello, everyone. Here we are for our next installment for History 185. We are moving, actually, I shouldn't say we're moving on from, we are actually still in the age of absolutism, which was part of our last lecture, having to do with the rise of absolute monarchies with such power that they could really build empires around the world. The two biggest ones eventually are going to be, of course, run by England and France, to the point where there's going to be a giant war that we're going to talk about in a bit called the 7 Years' War. And that war is going to really shake things up a bit globally when it comes to both England and France and their being the big kind of global powers of the time. But regardless of that, here is a map that shows you the dynasties, the big powers of the time in major events. And again, we've talked about some of this already, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what's happening on a visual sense. We've got that Romanov dynasty. That's the same family as the famous Anastasia story. Sorry to tell you all, which you already know, I'm sure, is Anastasia was killed with the rest of the family when the Bolsheviks took over. So there was no Anastasia like the animated movie had hiding around in France. Civil war in England is going to happen. This is what happened when Charles I, King of England, tried to turn the monarchy into an absolute monarchy like so many others, and that did not work, and that was Charles I of the Stuart dynasty. The ultimate result is that the Stuarts are going to slowly kind of wane away, and there's going to be a whole new dynasty that starts right around here in the 1660s, which is a constitutional monarchy. We'll talk more about that a lot because that's what England is now, right? So we'll talk more about that whole thing as we move forward. We've got that 30 Years' War that happened in Germany, or in the German-speaking states, where a bunch of nations fought against each other for power and for religion throughout Germany. Right, that's the defenestration event. That's what happened there when a couple of guys got thrown out of a window. We've got here the Bourbon dynasty of France, right? The very powerful Bourbon family, which includes the Louis, right? Louis the 14th and all those guys, right? Who created this massive absolute empire out of the French monarchy. So these are the things that are going on. What's interesting is that despite the fact that you've got the Romanovs with, the heavy-fisted Romanov absolute rule here, and you've got this kind of fight happening here in England, including a civil war, and you've got this 30 Years' War happening over in the German states, and you've got the Bourbon dynasty becoming an absolute monarchy, also heavy-handed and taking all the power for the monarchy and not really leaving much for anybody else. While all that's happening, there's a social movement away from absolute power and divine right of kings. And that's what we're focusing on today or this week. And that is, of course, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. What's interesting is that none of these powers that you see here or any of the others that we've talked about, like the Austrians, the Prussians, none of them fought against the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment in any major way, as long as the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment didn't really try to limit the powers that were currently in play. Now, there's going to be pushback in some places, and that pushback will lead to bigger events later. But right here, when we're talking about the transition of the 1600s into the 1700s, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment was really more of a discussion amongst rich people, and it was slow to become something that really caused massive change. But we'll get to that. When it starts to cause massive change, as we move into the middle of the 1700s and into the 1800s, that's where you're going to have big fights between religious powers and political powers over both of those things, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Well, let's talk about some terms that come up from this point through the rest of the course. Okay, some very important terms. These are terms that get confusing in the modern day lexicon, because what we mean today by these terms is not necessarily the same thing politically or socially as they meant originally. And that's just because of the way we've politicized these terms in our current day. So let's start with it. Conservative. A conservative to an American today usually has to do with the fight between pro and anti-Trump forces, or or the GOP versus anybody else, or whatever. It's just kind of a political play, which is not really what conservative means. It doesn't have to do with the GOP. Conservative, the term itself, is not owned by the GOP. It's not owned by Trump. It's not owned by Bush. It's not owned by Reagan. It's not owned by anybody, really. It is a term that simply means something. What it means is, and we'll get into this more, but a conservative, all it means when we mention this in this PowerPoint or any other lecture for this class, all it means is the people that like things the way they are and don't want to change. And by that, I don't necessarily mean backwards or redneck or hicks or something. That's not what I mean by that. I'm not going that way. What I mean is conservative, just people that are used to the way things are. They're into tradition. They like, the religion the way it is, and they like the political system the way it is. And maybe they're getting something from that and they don't want to change. They don't want to screw things up. And that is all a conservative is in this case, okay? And that might be parts of the Catholic Church of the time, and that might be the Bourbon dynasty of France. The Louis are going to be very conservative. They don't want to change. They don't want to give more rights to other people, through some sort of, new Enlightenment policy that might be coming. You know what I mean? So it's people that just like the old ways, which isn't always bad, right? Liberal. Today in America, liberal is going to have all kinds of other meanings, for some good, for some bad, but usually it has to do with, liberal, people that are going up against the conservative values and, flying flags behind AOC, going into the fight of the blah, 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 and this and that. That's not what liberal means either. Okay. Americans have taken the word and turned it into a battle cry. They've militarized it. Liberal simply means somebody whose mind is open enough to try new things. Trying new things is usually experimenting with stuff. The problem is that can lead to good or bad results. All right. It's not better. It's not worse. It just is. Okay. None of these things are better or worse. They just are. And people have to decide what's right for them. So liberal, if you look it up in the dictionary, you've got the answer for what a liberal is, the same way you can do with a conservative, which is essentially someone or a group of people who are looking to question the way things are, who are questioning conservative values because they're looking to make things better for maybe a different group, which, again, does not always mean better for everybody. Republicanism, when that word comes up, it doesn't mean the Republican Party in the United States. Republicanism is a word that simply means a republic. It means having some kind of representative democracy, like the American political system. Okay, we are a republic or a democratic republic. That's all that means. The idea for having a democratic republic didn't exist in the 1600s, but as we move into the 1700s, people are going to philosophize about the idea. What happens if we get rid of a king? How do we rule ourselves? Well, a republic of kind of wealthy landowners might be the answer, and that's what the United States is going to create. Okay, and so republicanism, again, does not mean the GOP or anything like that. It just means a Republican style of government. Okay, let's see, we go further. A salon. This means lots of things depending on where you were or where you are. In the maritime world, it actually means the deck below the top deck. The deck where you go down and where your beds are and all that stuff. The salon. To most of us, it also means where you go get your hairs did. But back in the day, back in the 1700s, late 1600s, a salon was basically a type of meeting room where you went to go hang out. And usually it was where wealthy, exclusive people went to go hang out, and they talked about their Enlightenment and scientific philosophies. Usually pretty much harmless. Okay, so when you hear salon, we're not talking about people going in to get their hairs done. Okay, and then finally, philosophe. I bring that up because this is going to start coming up too. A philosophe is just the French word for philosophizing, to be a philosopher. And of course, in English, the word has been translated into philosopher. Okay, so philosophe, that's just how it was first said. If you were a philosophe, you were a wealthy person who was going to a salon to discuss Republican ideals or liberal ideals and even conservative ideals as the Europeans knew them back in the 16 and early 1700s. Boom. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. Let's move into 18th century politics. A couple of reminders. Britain, a constitutional monarchy. It's the only one of its type. in the world at the time. That doesn't make it a safer, happier place for people. That just means that that's the type of government it has a constitutional monarchy where the ruler, the king or queen, is limited in power by Parliament. Okay, so it's the closest thing the world has ever seen at that time to a republicanist government, one that actually has sort of a larger amount of representative power than anybody else has got. This is going to allow Britain to do things that other countries cannot do. And we'll get into that as we move forward. I don't want to put the horse ahead of, or the cart before the horse. I think I'm trying to say France, right? We remember these guys, royal absolutism, right? The power of France has gone beyond, as far as cultivating its power into the monarchy is higher than any other nation in Europe at the time. Even the Romanovs can't do it the way the French have done it. And I think it's because the French had more money. Their economy was a bit better, so they were able to really use that royal power in ways that even the Russians couldn't. Prussia, the Habsburg Empire, which has to do with a ruling family in and around Prussia and Germany and Russia, right? We have those guys are doing something called Enlightened despotism. And what that means is that they are absolute monarchs who have allowed their nobles and some of their common classes to have some more rights than they usually would. Not many, but just enough that it feels like they're doing something new, and these guys are being influenced by Enlightenment and scientific ideas that are coming out at the time. Enlightened despotism, that just you're still a dictator. It's just that you're issuing in some policies that might benefit your economy or your political station a little bit more that you found out from philosophers. Okay, the Ottoman Empire, old school, ancient style empire. Right? So these are the big players of the time. Let's want to put that up there. That's where we are. Okay, so here's the big question as we move into the late 1600s. What happens if there are enough wealthy and educated people in a society, thanks to the Renaissance and market revolution? Remember that lecture a few weeks ago? That is where we've got a lot of common class people or wealthy people who are not nobles, who are making money, like tons of money, by being involved in colonial trade, making ships, building ships, sailing ships, making products, selling products. These are people who may not be nobles, but they're making money to the point where they're kind of like a new type of nobility. We would call them bourgeoisie. Okay, so let's go back to it. There are enough wealthy and educated people in a society, thanks to, say, the Renaissance and market revolution, who are not connected to the church or nobility. What happens if you have a society where there's quite a few people who happen to be wealthy and educated and are not tied to the conservative principles of the church or the nobility? Well, they start to hang out and they start to ask questions such as why? Why does the church say this thing about the way it works? Or why does the nobility have this power? And someone says, well, they claim divine right. And people will keep on asking that question, why? Like a 2-year-old will question a parent, why, mommy? Why? Right? That's kind of what happens is people have the time. If you're wealthy and you're not connected to the old conservative ideals, you might start hanging out with people, having some drinks, having some parties in salons, and you might start to discuss or philosophize about the way things are, why they are the way they are, and maybe if they should be changed. That's dangerous if you start to actually make change, but it doesn't start quite that fast. And the old answer, because God made it that way, isn't enough for these people, these bourgeoisie people meeting in their salons, right? So that's really the deal. People have been discovering things as we move forward. We've got people discovering ancient monuments. We've got people like Heinrich Schliemann, a self-avowed archaeologist, but really more of a treasure hunter, going down and discovering the ancient site of the Trojan War. Perhaps, we have people going into Egypt, just kind of wealthy people who are going to explore and checking things out and finding things, and they're just starting to ask questions. Okay, and you've even got people who are wondering about bones they're finding, both in America and also in Europe. And it turns out they're discovering things like dinosaur bones, and the church did not recognize that there were dinosaurs. And so people would ask questions like that. Well, what are these? Are these about creatures that are extinct? Well, dinosaurs aren't in the Bible, and therefore the church would say, well, God put those there for our amusement. I'm not kidding. That's what they say. And people would ask about the stars. What's out there? Are those like our sun? What are those things? And the church's response would be, God put those there for our amusement. That actually shows up in the Bible twice. That idea that stars are just there for our amusement. There is nothing else out there. And of course, there's the old beliefs like, well, obviously everything rotates around the earth. And then you've got people like Galileo saying, right? Maybe not. And so the deal is that you've got some people questioning things. And they do it quietly at first, and they just do it in their salons and they're hanging out. But eventually they're going to start to question things publicly, and that starts to get people asking even more questions. And that's what's going to lead to conflict between the liberal elites and the conservative elites. Okay, moving forward. This is when people start to publish their ideas, and that's when there's trouble. All right, where there's going to be revolutions and upheaval. All right, so let's get to this when all this starts. The Age of Enlightenment. All right. Let's define it. I'm just going to read the slide. The Enlightenment was a period of new intellectual philosophies that stressed reason, thought, and the power of individuals to solve problems. This means instead of going to a church official and saying, help me fix this, tell me what God would do, and the church official would kind of read something mystically in Latin and say it's fixed, or give you some holy water in a lead bottle and say, take that to your farm and drop it onto your farm and you'll have crops. Maybe there's some scientific way to fix like the harvest or whatever it is, right? So this is the idea of reason, thought, and the power of individuals to solve problems, creative ingenuity. That's the Enlightenment. Also known as the Age of Reason. We also put a little T in there as a bit of a joke, but not really. The Age of Treason. The more you ask questions like this, all right, reason, thought, and the power of individuals over that of the church or old conservative monarchs to solve problems, then you've got treason. You've got people who are going to be seen as treasonous against the old ways, and there's going to be some fights, okay? But really, it's called the Age of Reason. Significance of this period of time, then, the Enlightenment changes the way people view society. It would lead to several political revolutions. The American War of Independence is partially about this. The French Revolution, which kind of goes off in its own crazy, whatever, dystopia, that's going to be offset in part by this, okay, by this age. The scientific revolution, I was just talking about the Age of Enlightenment. That's kind of people thinking and talking and publishing things, okay? The scientific revolution is happening at the same time, okay? They're both part of the same era of time, but they're two different sort of processes, okay? So the scientific revolution is more about this. Due to the exploration for colonies, meaning England and France and the Dutch and others sending out ships to go and claim colonies, there's also people of curiosity, people like scientists and stuff that are going along, naturalists and other observers are going along on these naval ships to basically take notes and to discover new species of creatures and that sort of thing, wherever these naval ships go. Honestly, if I were in the Navy of the 1700s, I would want to be one of those guys. I wouldn't be as interested in being a naval officer or a sailor or what have you. I'd be more interested, I think, in being the guy that comes along for the ride who happens to be a naturalist, or some kind of scientist that's going along. That would be, I think, really fun. But it was too expensive to outfit ships to go on your own to go explore. So you just kind of went wherever the Navy took you while it was exploring the world. So during this period of naval expansion of major countries like England and France and others, there are going to be discoveries of new lands that the Europeans hadn't seen before. And with those new lands, there's new discoveries that cause people to question things. New plants and animals, for instance, which are immediate, but then there's other things that come up as well. So the description, a very simple, description of the scientific revolution is a willingness of some to question old beliefs, which are conservative beliefs, observation of the world, with an attempt to figure out what's really happening, and experimentation. Okay. That leads us to something called the scientific method, which was created pretty early on in this process as folks were trying to figure out, well, how do you observe things and come up with hypotheses and theories and all that stuff, right? How do we try to understand how the world really works? Okay, the church says because God made it that way, maybe we want something more, a better description. So this is a new interest in the physical world, the scientific method that led to a new approach in exploration. Here it is. This was originally created by Descartes. That's his Descartes. This is the I think therefore I am guy, and Bacon. No, that's not a food product. That's his actual name. By two philosophers, Descartes and Bacon, and then others will improve upon it. Okay. What is the method of science? Ask a question, form a hypothesis to attempt to answer the question, perform an experiment to see if the hypothesis works out or not, and use the results to prove that hypothesis or change it. Once you've proved it, of course, it becomes a theory. And a theory is a proven hypothesis that moves forward is basically, I don't want to say fact, but it basically is, it's what it is until someone changes it with new evidence. Okay, so that's where we are, the scientific method. So you've got a bunch of pretty wealthy people who've got time on their hands who are going to run around and basically start doing this, right? The scientific method all over the place. And the Enlightenment folks will be taking whatever the scientists figure out and try to make sense of it with all their academic philosophies as they talk with each other in their salons. That's how all this kind of comes together. Yes, this time with the Enlightenment and scientific revolution is very dangerous. Galileo, he's this guy, you can look him up if you haven't heard of him before, was sued by the church to renounce his discoveries of the solar system on pain of death. All right, this is the way the church worked at this time and had been, was Galileo, you're telling people about things that we don't want them to understand because it takes away the mystery of God. So, the less knowledgeable people are about the universe, the more they rely on the church to tell them how things actually work. Therefore, we need you to say that you're wrong about your discoveries or we'll set you on fire. What do you say? Okay, that's the way the church worked. And eventually people are going to realize more and more how the church is really trying to be its own absolute power by threatening people with this kind of disaster, this kind of harm to keep science from moving forward. And that's basically the big fight that continues today. All right. Copernicus is going to be a guy that moves forward with some of Galileo's discoveries much later on. And he's going to discover something called the heliocentric universe. Helio means sun. So basically, he's the one that essentially discovers that everything in the solar system goes around the sun. There was a belief before this that the sun and everything else went around the earth, that the earth was the center of the universe, and that's the way God made it, right? That people are all important. So Newton and his heliocentric universe was written and published with all of its proven theory, and he had to die before he would allow his discoveries to be published because he was worried that the church would kill him. Okay, that's kind of where he was, all right? Most others would temper their discoveries with religious platitudes, which is to say that many scientists and Enlightenment people would say a lot about, with reference to God, and God is the best and everything about that, but here's some ideas, and God should be involved in this process. And, they were trying to appease the church in the old way while posing their new ideas, so they're being very political about it. And some were so powerful that they just didn't care. Some scientists and Enlightenment folks just had so much money that they just didn't care. They would put anything out there and no one could touch them. So we have all these different kind of groups that move forward as we move into the scientific and Enlightenment revolutions. This is kind of fun. The Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris. Paris, despite the fact that it was an absolute monarchy, was very open to scientists and philosophers. They were very open to it. The French were not open to actually doing much with it. They were just open to allowing people to talk about it because the kings of France were not too worried about being toppled by the Enlightenment, which, was fine until 1790 when it happened. But anyway, in 1700, here are the official scientific societies, meaning clubs of people that are actually actively doing science. All right, how many scientific societies are in France, and in the world. In the world, there are only 5. How many scientific societies are in France alone? 2, which is a pretty significant number in 1700 of the existing 5 scientific clubs of people that are trying to discover new things. Look what happens in 89 years. In 1789, there are 65 societies around the world of people trying to discover new things, and 29 of those, still a significant number, are in France. France is really a hotbed of scientific knowledge. It's just that what the French do is they set up this academy, right? The Royal Academy of Science. And if you come up with anything new, they have to sit there and debate it for sometimes years before anything happens. The direct opposite was true in England. They're just like, oh, go ahead and try out your ideas and see what happens. Even if it kills people, we don't care. Have fun, good and bad. All right. So to give you some idea of what these scientist guys are like, right? Zoologists and biologists, and here they are basically all doing their writings and discoverings and dissections of critters to discover how bodies work and all this stuff, right? They're all rich people, okay? People that travel with those naval ships are finding things that no one has seen before in Europe. Cocoa plants, right? For instance, discovered in Jamaica. You got people collecting beetles to discover more about the beetles and how they work and see if there's any benefit to humanity that can be brought in from the beetles, right? And there's all these rich people that basically are traveling around the world that have this money to collect things. They're collecting natural specimens. They are collecting ancient things from people that will sell them. So like treasure hunters going into Egypt or something like that, right? And they're basically building up their collections of natural things and historical things in their homes and inviting people into their homes. One of the crazy stories, you know what? I'm just going to put that up as an assignment, I think. The Elgin marbles is an absolutely insane story of a private collector who basically stole a bunch of marble statues from a former ancient society and threw them in his house and had parties there, right? And basically, those marbles, those ancient statues were slowly but surely destroyed in the process, and that was very standard at the time. Eventually, however, as people died, they would bequeath their things, to private societies, and you'll have the first ever museums that are filled with all these things that these private rich people collected. Women in science, yes, there were women in the scientific revolution, and they wrote stuff too, and they were a big part of it. This is fun, where you have this couple, a German astronomer, wife and husband, who are examining the heavens using giant telescopes that they made in astrolabes, and they published together. Okay, we'll talk more about that too. Origins of the Enlightenment. Let's talk about the Enlightenment as we move forward. Religious origins, okay? It's interesting to say that the Enlightenment does have a religion attached to it, even though it's really questioning of the old religion to create a new one. So the idea of the Enlightenment is the support of a rational religion free from mysteries, miracles, and superstitions. So the support of a religion. Remember, these are people that are doing all their philosophies and scientific discoveries during a religious time in European history, where the church holds complete and utter sway over people. So naturally, the idea of thinking through things from a religious standpoint is just the way people are. So they have to figure out how to do it. And if it's not the Catholic faith or the Protestant faith, then what's it going to be? So they're going to invent, the Enlightenment philosophers are going to invent a new religion. And that religion is called deism, okay? Which is the belief in the existence of a God or supreme being, but a denial of revealed religion. Let me explain that real fast. This is just the idea that God exists, which gives you the idea then that, of course, that there's some sort of higher power involved in everything, and that's going to help to appease the people that are super religious at the time. But what the deists will say, these Enlightenment folks, is that God exists, and God came and created everything. And then he basically left, and he's doing something else, and we haven't seen him in a long time, and he's not hanging out waiting to give us miracles or send down angels to do things for us or whatever. He's not here. So he created everything, set everything up upon scientific principles, the way the world works and the universe works, and it's up to us to decide how to use it. Okay, that's what deism is. I hope that made sense in some way. The watchmaker's theory is part of deism. I love this thing. I think it's a fascinating way to look at the universe, and it's just the way these guys were trying to figure it out at the time. Okay, the watchmaker's theory. If you look at an old watch, an old mechanical watch, the way they were made at the time, it's all gears, right, that are put into motion using a spring, a very delicate spring. And the idea of the deist watchmaker's theory is that the entire universe is a big giant watch, basically, and it all moves around kind of like gears in a watch does, with ratios and spring tension. And basically everything moves upon a certain kind of scientific principle, right? The moon going around the earth, and the earth going around the sun, and the way the comets move, and the way the oceans move, and the way that dust moves, and the way that bodies are born and eventually grow old. And everything is basically based on some kind of scientific methodology, based on kind of mechanics, like the watchmaker's theory. I love it. I personally am a fan, although it's kind of simplistic. I personally am a fan of that idea, because the universe does work on scientific principles that can be formulated out, that you could actually discover and then learn how to work within. And what the heck, why not? And the way that the people of the time got around saying that that everything works upon scientific principles like a watch does is to say that at least God made it all. God made it. God invented everything that science can discover. God invented the planets and the universe and everything else, and we're just learning how to use it, all right, how to understand it. And understanding science, according to a deist, would be understanding God. Okay? So that's where you have a type of interesting religious principle involved here. Okay, moving on. Deists, in this sense, see no point in any particular religion. They recognized only a distant God, uninvolved in the daily life of man. People like Thomas Jefferson, major deists. All right, this is the way they were. You didn't see Jefferson going into a church a lot, because him philosophizing was a religious thing to him. Okay, moving forward. Bridging the gap between the religious and the other religious. Okay, pantheism. Pantheism is an interesting belief that God and nature are the same thing, okay, which I don't disagree with myself. That goes back to the watchmaker's theory stuff and deism, all right, that these Enlightenment guys really get going on. The idea that God and nature are one and the same. You don't have God and then nature. God and nature are the same thing. So if you work with nature, discover nature, harness nature, you're also working with and harnessing and discovering God. Right, that's the way that scientists at the time would think about it. So gradually, highly educated Protestants and Catholics thought more about God's work as revealed through science rather than through the scriptures. Okay, so Darwin's one of those. Darwin, the guy that creates the idea of evolution and natural selection, whatever you believe or don't believe on that's the guy that does that. Okay, Darwin was a Catholic priest who was also educated, and he went off on a naval ship and went to go discover things, like so many were at the time, and he himself saw the world change at a time when the church said that nothing has changed since God made it. Okay, that's what the church would say. So Darwin would say to the church elders, we have discovered seashells on top of a mountain. Does that not mean that there used to be an ocean on top of this mountain? And the church would say, no. Again, I'm going back to the old thing, because the church did this a lot. No, God put those seashells up there for our amusement. Nothing has changed. There did not used to be an ocean here, and the earth is only a few thousand years old. So meh. Right? So the deal is that you got Darwin then saying, but there's seashells on top of the mountain, and look, there was an earthquake just now, and I saw part of an island fall into the ocean. That's change, right? So that's Darwin, and Darwin's going to be, of course, a very controversial figure, because he publishes his findings based on the understanding of how all that works at the time. Okay, here's some centers of enlightenment where salons are, where people are learning and thinking and philosophizing and publishing, right? Everywhere from Sweden all the way down to Italy, and a little bit over there in London, and even one in Madrid, the center of the Catholic universe. So, when it comes to the Spanish Empire. So there you go, right? You've actually got some centers of learning, even in St. Petersburg, the western capital of Russia. Okay, a couple of characteristics of this period: optimism and self-confidence, the belief that man is good, and the belief in social progress. Okay, freedom of thought and expression, bringing liberty to all men. So essentially, eventually, the absolutist governments are going to have to end. That's where the absolutist governments are going to have a problem with this whole thing, the Enlightenment, and the education of the masses. The idea that the only people that deserve to learn how to read and write and be educated are rich people is something that liberal elites in this time, meaning your Enlightenment people, are going to not like, and they're going to want to change that. You cannot have something, for instance, like a republicanist government without an educated populace. Okay, you don't have a United States forming without the idea of creating a national public education system so that the populace can understand how to do things like go vote, right? That's just part of it. You can't have an enlightenment without education. Okay, so the philosophe, we talked about that before, someone who's being a philosopher. Students of society who analyzed its evils and advanced reforms. So that's what a philosophe is. And the great debate. Reason and logic. Again, this is just for your notes. Rationalism, empiricism, tolerance, skepticism, and deism. These are all part of the Enlightenment mindset. Rationalism, let's be rational and figure out how things work. Empiricism, let's prove how it works. Tolerance, let's not assume that someone has to die because they're different. Skepticism, let's be skeptical about people saying that they saw a miracle happen. Maybe there's a scientific reason for that thing happening. Deism, the idea that you're not waiting for God to give you miracles to do things. Okay, let's see. And then finally, so one side is more liberal, the other side is more conservative. Traditions and superstitions, that's the more conservative side for the Europeans of the time, which is nostalgia for the past. We like the way that things have always been. Organized religion is the way to go. It helps to keep the masses organized and safe. Irrationalism, meaning belief in things like miracles, right? And emotionalism, the idea that emotional prayer will solve your problems. Okay, that's the great debate, and these two sides still fight each other today. I want to narrow this down to two people, the great debate, reason and logic versus tradition and superstition. You've got philosophers on both sides. It's not just one side, but on both sides, okay? So on the left, let me put their names up. There you go, Hobbes versus Locke. These guys are famous. These are two English philosophers. One is a conservative, and one is a liberal. Of their period. Again, don't get that confused with modern American politics. So Hobbes, a guy named Hobbes, believes in absolute power. He even dresses like the king of the time with the mustache and the whole thing. He believes that a monarch's rule is justified by God, by divine right. That monarch can do anything, and that's on purpose, okay? Locke, however, natural rights, believes that all people have natural rights and that a government's power really comes from the people, not from God. So that's John Locke. You can almost see it. Conservative versus liberal. Look at the eyes. Kind of has those like, I'm thinking, I'm intellectually wondering about the world, whereas he's like, do it or die, right? Very, very obvious changes. Okay, let's move forward. Government philosophers. Let's talk a bit about these guys and what they thought. Back to Hobbes. That's this guy on the left. All right, social contract. Document that he wrote, the most famous one called the Leviathan, which is, of course, is a big giant monster. Believe that people give up some of their rights in exchange for law and order, i.e., you need a dictator because people are naturally bad and people need to give up their rights because people will always try to kill each other, hurt each other, steal from each other. That's what Hobbes thought. So Hobbes' ideal government is an absolute monarchy and a ruler that had total power to keep the citizens, the mob, under control. Guess who likes this guy? All the monarchs of Europe, all the old conservative nobility of Europe. King Louis XIV would love a guy like this, okay? Charles I, who got himself beheaded, right, by Parliament, loved this guy, okay? Just to be real clear. All right, How about John Locke? What does he do? Well, he philosophizes too between this period. Two treatises of government, two books that I'm going to narrow down the important parts for us into a couple of statements. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you read his books. That'll take you ages. 1690, here he is, right? Being all, yes, I know, guys. He does look a lot like, if you've ever had a philosophy class at OCC, you might have taken it from Charles Otwell, Professor Otwell, who has the students call him Chaz. If you look at Charles Otwell, he looks just like this dude. OCC Professor Charles Otwell is just like John Locke, which he wouldn't appreciate because he really liked Hume, the philosopher named Hume over Locke. But he looks like Locke. I'm sorry, he just does. All right. So two treatises of government. Let me break down the important parts of that. Okay. John Locke believes in natural rights, as opposed to, say, Hobbes, who believed in divine right of kings. Positive view of human nature, John Locke believes that all people are born free and equal with natural rights, and he's the one that comes up with this: life, liberty, and property. Everybody has the right to their lives, to their freedoms, and to own property. And he's saying this, Locke is saying this at a time when generally governments could take all three of these very easily, very, very quickly and very easily. And he's saying, John Locke is saying that the role of a government is not to be a dictatorship and be able to take life, liberty, and property at will, but to protect an individual's life, liberty, and property. That's what he says. Hopefully that sounds familiar because there's somebody else who started saying this who got the idea from John Locke. All right, we'll talk about that in a second. Hobbes, the main disagreement that Locke has with Hobbes, Locke believes that the government existed to protect these natural rights, and if they failed to do so, the citizens should overthrow their government. This is where we get into not the age of reason, but the age of treason. Okay, this is something that could get John Locke in trouble because he's saying that people have the right to overthrow a government. Now, the church of the time, and for all time, would say, no, you don't, because kings have divine right to rule. So if you rebel against a king, you are going up against God. But John Locke is a deist. And John Locke says there is no God hanging out. God made everything and he's off playing golf or something. There is no God here for us to interfere with. God wants people to figure out the world for themselves. He gave us a brain and he gave us ability, so let's go do it. And therefore, we can create a government wherein kings do not have divine right, but instead answer to the people, right? That's what he's saying, okay? So that's John Locke versus guys like Hobbes, okay? Liberal versus conservative of that time. And he, of course, unlike Hobbes, John Locke believes that, as I was saying, the divine right of kings was nonsense. Okay. Who are people influenced by the ideas of John Locke? Well, let's look at this guy, Thomas Paine. You've heard of him in the United States, probably, who wrote Common Sense. That's going to help lead people towards a revolution. He also writes The Rights of Man in 1791, which is very similar to the French version. Okay. American philosophers or philosophers, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, these are all people influenced by Enlightenment thinkers in Europe. And Thomas Jefferson's the one that copies John Locke's idea of life, liberty, and property. But instead, Thomas Jefferson, being a bit more poetic, says pursuit of happiness. And what that means is pursuit of happiness to own and dispose of property the way you'd like. He just took it another creative step. Okay. And this is going to lead, mainly Enlightenment ideas leads to wealthy people to lead a rebellion in the American colonies in 1776 that will ultimately result in the very first Republican government, a democratic republic in history, which will be right here. Okay. And we still have it today. It started off a bit roughly, and we're not going to get into that. That's a History 170 class if you want to do it. All right. Voltaire, I just want to bring him up. A couple things that Voltaire said, a very interesting French philosopher. Here's some quotes of Voltaire. Judge a man by his question rather than by his answers. This is good stuff for fortune cookies. Men are equal. It is not birth, but virtue that makes the difference. So he's saying that there's no such thing as nobility or peasant class people by birth. It is, what their virtue is. Prejudice is opinion without judgment. The way to become boring is to say everything. I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That was Voltaire. Every now and then you see someone bring that up and say it because there were some American philosophers that borrowed that and said it too during the Revolutionary period, but that was from Voltaire. If you want to sound super smart, when someone puts that up and say, hey, nice Voltaire quote, right? How about this guy, Baron de Montesquieu, another French guy, okay? 3 types of government he comes up with. He says there are 3 types of government in this world. There's a monarchy, there's a republic, and there's despotism, right? Now, Baron de Montesquieu is going to come up with well, how do we create a republic and get rid of the monarchy and the despots? How do we do it? He says we need to have some kind of human-made government, the same kind that John Locke wants, the republic of some kind, that protects itself through a separation of power. So there's no one powerful despot or monarch that arises in your republic. That will ensure freedom and liberty. Yes, guys, it is Montesquieu that came up with the idea of an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch. That is his ideas that were then used by Americans to create the constitutional system here in the United States based on Montesquieu's philosophies. Directly based on it. Look at the date range. 1689 to 1755. America's Constitution is going to be created in 1787, based on the ideas of this dude. Popularizing the Enlightenment. How do you make it popular and get people involved in it? Well, here's an image of a salon like I was talking about, where people are hanging out and chatting and meeting and doing things. It's like an episode of Bridgerton or something like that, right? Here is Madame Joffrin's salon. It's somebody who, a woman who actually opened up her mansion, her estate, to people coming and having meetings about sciences and philosophies. It's basically conferences is the way we would look at these today. Madame Joffrin is one of those. We've got others like Mademoiselle Julie de L'Espanasse. I don't know if I pronounced that right. She was one that was wealthy enough to be able to host meetings at her house, right? Madame Necker, right, did the same thing. A lot of English and French noble women and a couple of Austrians. The Marquis de Condorcet, Progress of the Human Mind. He writes this book. It gets published. Lots of people read it. Gets into the idea of needing a free and equal education for people, a constitutional government like what the British made and what the Americans have made during his lifetime, equal rights for women. He actually says that, equal rights for women. Many philosophers were people of their time, and they did not agree with that part, but many are going to start to fight for it. Wealthy Jewish women will create 9 of the 14 salons in Berlin. Might be an irony to that. In Warsaw, Princess Zofia will gather around her, this is in Poland, the reform leaders of Poland, Lithuania, and will help to create a enlightened, at the time, despotic government. Middle-class women in London will use their salons to raise money to publish women's writings. Later on, middle-class women are the ones that are going to begin the women's rights movement in England, and they're going to be the ones that actually fight for the right to vote in England. And middle-class women in the United States will copy that a few years later and create the women's rights movement in the United States and push forth the right to vote, which is finally granted in 1920. Okay, how about some female writers? Not just people that hosted things like conferences at their mansions. What about actual female philosophers? Let's name a couple of them. All right, a few of them here. One, Émilie du Châtelet, a French noblewoman, very famous for her writings, wrote about mathematics and the physics of Wilhelm von Leibniz and Isaac Newton. Right? Her lover, Voltaire, learned much of his science from her. Voltaire was not a scientist, right? So he was a philosopher and a writer, kind of like a French Ben Franklin. He wasn't really a scientist, and so he actually worked with her to actually understand sciences. Okay, how about Denis Diderot? All things must be examined, debated, investigated without exception and without regard for anyone's feelings. Right? So let's take emotion out of things and understand how the world works. Dennis Diderot, right? I'm just kind of presenting some of these different philosophers that you may or may not have heard of before. We will speak against senseless laws until they are reformed, and while we wait, we will abide by them. Meaning, we're going to reform laws that are senseless, but we're not going to revolt and kill people over them, right? So he's one of those guys that wants to change things, but does not want to cause a revolution, if that makes any sense. How about this? Diderot, he is famous for this. Publishes the first massive encyclopedia of the sciences. Many, 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 many tomes or pages in his tome of what things are, right? The complete cycle of knowledge. This guy puts in there 28 books, alphabetical, cross-reference, illustrated like a modern system. All right, this guy, freaking brilliant, this dude. First published in 1751. It was expensive, 1,500 livres. That's, I think if you put that in today, I think that's a couple $1,000. All right. But it was expensive to do stuff like this back then. But take a look, everything in there from the farming sciences to anatomy, right? I mean, this is, if you wanted to know everything there was to know in sciences at the time, you would go and buy a set of Diderot's encyclopedia. Everything you could want to know, even from actually making clothing. I mean, everything's in here. This is a wealth of knowledge. If you want to make a good, how to make canals and levees, if you want to put something into a time capsule about the human race as of, 1800, he's probably the guy. It's his stuff you put into the time capsule. How to do things like create charcoal and smelt metal, build furniture. I mean, this guy was something else. Other people will copy these ideas. Ben Franklin is one of them who creates his own version of the encyclopedia. And these are people who subscribed to it and got copies of the encyclopedia as it came out. Just to show you that you've got people throughout Europe who are actually, subscribed to Diderot's encyclopedia, who get mailings. Pretty cool. I wonder if you could buy ads in that thing. All right, moving forward. How about reading during the Enlightenment? What are some numbers? 80% for men and 60% for women. You can't have an Enlightenment without being able to read. Books were expensive at the time, so you would usually buy a book and share it with everybody. So you might have 20 people reading one book, which is another reason why you would have those big salon gatherings. One person would buy a book and then read it to everybody. That's kind of one of the ways that you made that more affordable. Novels, plays, and other literature were part of these books. Journals, memoirs, the private lives of so-and-so, part of these books. Philosophy, history, and theology was also a form of books that came out that people would buy and read to each other, right? But it requires, to have an enlightenment like this, to actually have a change in society for everybody, people simply have to be curious. They have to want to read and write and study, and that's what we have. You guys are doing that now. You guys are part of an enlightenment because you as students are doing all these things that we're talking about. Talk about more when it comes to France, right? Literacy in urban France, urban meaning where lots of people live. 1683, 51% of the French people could read. By 1770, 60%. That's, a certain market rise, pretty good. In Normandy, this is rural Normandy. So instead of like urban France, you're in the part of France where it's all farms. In the late 1600s, 37% of males could read and 7% of females. By the late 18th century, by the late 1700s, 73% of males can read and 46 females, right? Percent of females in the farming territory of Normandy. That's a huge jump, right? 1500 in the German states, 3 to 4% could read, all right? By 1800, 50% of the entire region could read. Huge amount of the population. So it's an increase of literacy at the time, which leads to science and enlightenment. These are the books you would buy if you could afford them. The things you had to have and you had to read if you really wanted to know, right? Isaac Newton, John Locke, John Locke again, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, the social contract guy, right? Dennis Diderot in his encyclopedia, and then of course the progress of the human mind from Concordace. This is great stuff, right? These are the books you have if you want to really understand things. If you live back in the 1700s. And we're going to finish up with some ideas of what kind of leaders who were still despots, were dictators, but who used Enlightenment ideas to just kind of help actually increase their power without really changing their government much. All right. So Frederick the Great of Prussia, we mentioned him in the last lecture as a guy that created Prussia. He a soldier king, and he actually starts saying that he is a servant of the state. The state doesn't serve him, he serves the state. And he's going to make some changes to kind of improve the conditions of people in Prussia, which is going to help him become extremely popular amongst the people of Prussia. Catherine the Great, the 1760s, right? She is going to basically help enslave peasants in ways that they had not been enslaved before. She was not very helpful with them, but she does increase the economy of Russia by adopting Enlightenment principles that allow for better free trade. So she's not really, I don't want to say that, oh, she's an Enlightenment queen and great for people. She hurt as many people as anybody in Russia. It's just that she is going to help increase Russia's wealth and noble standing, the standing of the nobility, by using Enlightenment principles, i.e. the science stuff. Okay. Joseph II of Austria, mother was Maria Theresa. He's going to make some changes as well. That's going to improve the conditions of the economy and the nobles and some of the common classes in Austria, mostly having to do with trade. Opening up trade in kind of a more capitalist sort of way, which also is an Enlightenment idea. Capitalism. And he's going to try to make improvements in the German states. He's actually, this guy, Joseph of Austria, he's actually the Holy Roman Emperor, meaning the Pope said, you're the powerful Catholic here. You're in charge of all those German states. And so he is going to try to actually improve the German states in a way where the lives of the people are a little bit better, that there's more trade and more economy. And he's going to try to kind of arrange things so that there's never again a 30 years war, like a religious war that happens there. I'm not saying he was really successful, but he tried because he was an Enlightenment era thinker. Some of the changes that probably are the most important. 1781 declares toleration in the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, meaning no more frickin' religious wars there. Stop it. And 1781, the same year, the abolition of serfdom and feudal dues. No more serfdom. No more people tied to their land like slaves, like it's the Middle Ages. People get to move around and they're not paying feudal like debts to their leaders and stuck on lands, basically acting like a slave. So he basically frees people a little bit in a way that had never happened in the German states. That's Enlightenment thinking, right? Let's finish up. The legacy of the Enlightenment. 1. The democratic revolutions begun in America in 1776, thanks to the Enlightenment, and that continued in Amsterdam, Brussels, and especially in Paris, put every Western government on the defensive. It's going to be the age of revolutions and pushback. Reform, democracy, and republicanism had been placed irrevocably on the Western agenda. Okay, so there's going to be good and bad that comes from it. All right, good and bad. We're going to have a whole week where we just talk about the French Revolution because that was crazy times. And it's not going to be like, happy, really. It's going to be changed, but it's not going to be happy. New forms of civil society. We're going to sum this up. Clubs, salons, private academies, lending libraries, and professional scientific organizations all over the place. That's very different from what existed before the Enlightenment. 19th century conservatives blamed it for the modern egalitarian disease. Once reformers began to criticize established institutions, they didn't know where and when to stop. This is what the old school folks said. It's time to stop. This is a disease, all this change. Okay? 5. The legacy of the Enlightenment establishes a materialistic tradition based on a naturalist account of the human condition, a religion of nature, and theoretically endowed with full civil and legal rights, the individual had come into existence as a political and social force to be reckoned with. And I'm going to take this all the way back to the very beginning to end this overly long lecture that normally would take about a week to do, that here we are. Comes back to these questions. What happens if there are enough wealthy people who are not tied to the church and the nobility, who are wealthy thanks to the economy, for instance, who can just question why things are the way they are and prove new ideas, right? What happens when you have that? And the answer is you've got the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, and everything that happens as a result. And that's going to be an interesting topic as we move forward, the changes that happen for better or worse. Okay, guys, thanks a lot. You survived another one.